Thank you, Natalie, for that beautiful number. And also wanted to mention, and it was just, I guess it kind of all ties together, and that we're celebrating Connor just going away, but we're playing some Frisbee football, and Natalie took one right in the throat. And we were all like, she's supposed to sing tomorrow, okay? What are we doing? No, anyway, but very thankful. And then it just was a tremendous reminder. In fact, we were reflecting on that. I was even going to save it for tonight, but I thought since she sang, I would say it this morning. It's just an amazing blessing and answer of prayer, what God has done in healing her. Just the years of pain she endured and what she was out doing yesterday, and just wasn't possible. And God has done amazing work, and we are so thankful. And just want to rejoice in that, and it was fun to watch. And she is very good, too. She made some diving catches that are amazing. So anyway. On Thursday, March 20th, I received an urgent prayer request from Jeff Tuttle in regard to the ministry there of China Vision. You do have the outline is there, isn't it? Did I do it? Oh, I'm sorry. I think I did. Sometimes I forget, but anyway. All right, but Jeff Tuttle sent this urgent prayer request, and one of the classes, and it was taking place, the class in Urumqi, which is the place I've gone the last 3 times in teaching, had been raided, and the men leading it had been arrested. As of last week, in my ongoing communication with them and praying about this and for them, a couple of the men are still in jail. And Jeff ended his email with this statement. He said, "This is an important reminder to us that what we're doing in China is no game, that it is engaging in spiritual warfare." I know, and several of the men that I believe to be still imprisoned, I know one of them for sure is Pastor Ton, also Pastor Luther, and I pray for these men. I've been with these men for actually over 6 weeks. In the last 2 years, spent 6 weeks with them, and know their wives and their families, and was with Pastor Luther and his son, and been with his dad, been at his dad's place, eaten there with his parents. So I know these men, and my heart goes out to them. William was a translator, was there, and William's a young man who's tremendously gifted in English and Chinese and training for ministry, and he was a translator, and he's home. Young pastor was there, his first time over in China teaching, and he's home. A number of things were confiscated, but he is home. And then, of course, for the long-term training, it was a new group in China Vision, a group of young pastors who desperately need training and are faithful, dedicated, serving Christ. And so there's obviously some real concerns for the future of that ministry. I mention these events just because it connects so much to the text that we're going to look at this morning. It's important to remember that as we look in our Bibles, we're going to Romans chapter 13, that we are coming to a text that calls on us to live in submission to government authority. And when we see a government doing the kind of things they're doing to men in China that they're doing, I think of Pastor Saeed, who's in Iran and is in prison, and if you've been following that at all, and my heart goes out to his family and the men like that are standing for the gospel and being imprisoned for it. And when you think of that, you think of, well, how could we relate to a government that way? But we have to remember that Paul was writing at a time when Rome, not exactly the most upright governing system, was in power. When a Caesar who claimed himself to be God was in power. When there was a cult worship of the Caesar that people were being demanded to participate in was in power. And Paul writes to the church in Rome, of all places, where the power of the government was most oppressive. And he writes to them about their need to submit to authority. And it's kind of startling. It kind of takes us back. And it causes us to ask questions, and it causes us to wrestle through. And it is a good thing to be here. We know that as we walk through it, we need the Lord to grant us wisdom to know how to be good citizens of heaven, because our citizenship is not of this earth if we're the children of God. But at the same time, we're called to live as good citizens of our earthly countries. In fact, I would argue that this whole thing is an extension of Paul's very argument back in Romans 12, where he started out in pressing the issue of worship. And the result of true worship is always transformation, minds being renewed by God, lives being changed by God. That's what happens when we actually present ourselves to God in worship. God changes lives and then produces lives of genuine love. Because the love of God is shed abroad in the hearts of the children of God so that we love like we're loved by God. And so we begin loving God with a devotional love, and then we're called on to love our neighbor, and that outworking of these great commandments is what Paul is dealing with. And then he comes to an institution in which we'd go, you mean I need to love them too? You mean those oppressive government forces that are doing this kind of stuff? I'm supposed to love them too? Yeah. Well, how do I do that? You live in submission to their authority. That's how you do that. It really does press at the very nature of, again, worship. Because worship being transformational, and genuine worship is that transformation of what our nature is, which is rebellious naturally. And it's being transformed by grace so that we live out faith. We live out this love for God and love for neighbor. It is ultimately that genuine love that, as we looked at last week, enables us, as Romans 12 says, to repay no one evil for evil, but to give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. So if possible, as far as depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not become overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And not repaying evil for evil and giving careful thought to what is honorable applies not just to our neighbors, but it applies to authority that God has placed over us. In fact, I would suggest that the idea is similar to what Paul would say what John wrote in 1 John 4. In 1 John 4, verse 19 through 21, John says, we love because he first loved us. If anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. He who does not love his brother whom he's seen cannot love God whom he's not seen. This commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. And my point is just in 1 John, obviously, is a test of love, which is a part of John's whole test of the reality of being children of God. You want to know if you're a child of God or not? It's not your profession that proves the case, okay? What proves the case is the genuine transformation of your life, and 1 John just present test after test after test. This is what God does in the lives of his children. This is what God does in the lives of his children. Here's the fruit of a genuine relationship with God. You want to know the reality of your faith, read the book of 1 John over and over again and look for the evidence of a changed life. Because without a changed life, there's no evidence that you've ever genuinely been saved. I mean, there's genuine transformation that takes place when God changes a heart. And he puts this point because it's easy for people to say they love God, right? And John just turns it around and says, look, if you don't love your brother who you do see, you don't love God who you don't see. So how does this connect to the government passage? Well, it's just pretty simple. If you don't live in submission to the government you do see, you don't live in submission to the God you don't see. The authority that's right in front of you, that God ordained and placed in your life, if you live in rebellion to that authority, then ultimately you live in rebellion against God. And that's what he's pushing out on, because it's the nature of genuine conversion that brings about a transformed heart of submission. And, true conversion is marked by, just some of the marks of true conversion. Anyway, but I'm reading a number of books, and it just kind of all ties together in my own thinking. But, if you can't explain the gospel to somebody else, then you've never believed the gospel. If you can't explain, if somebody says, well, what's the gospel you say you believe? If you can't explain that, then how can you say you've believed it? Okay, that's just the first characteristic. And the second one is the transformed life, which I've already mentioned. And that's just all part of Romans 12:1. Your life's being transformed by the power of God. And guess what? God's power is greater in your rebellion. Aren't you glad? If it wasn't, you would never be saved. I mean, if God's power wasn't greater than my rebellious heart, I would have never been saved. Right? Not one person in this room would have ever been saved if God's power was not greater than the rebellion in your heart. So when God changes you, saves you, he changes that rebellious nature. He begins that transformation of life, and it's evidenced out in a genuine life of submission. And that third one is the long-term walk with Christ. There's been plenty of people profess faith, walk for a time in what appeared to be conversion, but then walk away. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's just like 1 John said. They left from us because they never really were of us. You know what? Salvation is never lost. Those God saves, he keeps. Kept by the power of God. You can't escape that power. The real question you always have to ask yourself is, have you ever genuinely been converted? And the evidence of true conversion is an ongoing walk with Christ. And that's just one of the evidence. I mean, you can remember. So as we look at the text, we'll just turn Romans 13. And we're looking at Romans 13, 1 to 7. And you should have received an outline in the bulletin. Don't worry about it, Kevin. It's going to be an outline in the bulletin. And you see there that I titled it, Genuine Love Submits to Authority. Genuine love, and I could add to it, which is a mark of true faith. Genuine love, right? Romans 12, key verse 9 in Romans 12. Let love be genuine, which is flowing out of this whole worship transformation. So genuine love, which is a mark of being a worshiper, being truly saved, submits to authority. We could phrase this in a phrase of a test. Love is genuine when it lives in submission to God-ordained authorities. We could phrase it as a result. Renewed minds transform our rebellious heart, producing honorable submission, tying back to Romans 12 and verse 17, giving careful thought to do what's honorable. So it produces honorable submission to God-ordained authorities. So, we could phrase it a lot of ways. I'm just trying to give you the flavor of this section as it relates to what we've seen so far in Romans 12, that Paul is moving, because it almost seems like he just jumped off track. We got worship and love and the outworking of it, and we come down into, and really obviously in verse 17 when he starts dealing with in 12, loving your enemies, what enemy came to mind? Well, obviously one enemy came to mind was the Roman government. They ultimately put Paul to death, right? And so the Roman government comes to mind, and so Paul, having just said you need to love your enemies and not retaliate and seek vengeance and rather do what's honorable, all of that instruction in light of that, what it means to love your neighbor, he then turns to the topic of government, to people living in an oppressive government system right in its capital. It'd be like us writing to Beijing, okay? And this was the instruction, and I would just say if this was the New Testament day, Paul was writing right now to Beijing, he would say the same thing to the believers there. Say the same thing to us. God's gift of faith and transforms our rebellious nature so that we live in genuine submission to authority, no longer rebels. In fact, Dr. McCune often said, there are no rebels in heaven. Folks, the day you trust Christ, you turn from your rebellious heart. Now, the outworking of salvation, meaning the ongoing setting apart work of God and in growing you up to be more like Christ, is that putting to death of that rebellion wherever it shows up. But the very nature of the live for self, do self, make self center of life, my way, drive life around me, dies on the day of salvation. The rebellious heart is transformed by God's power, and it is then marked. In fact, this whole concept just permeates the Bible. I apologize I didn't get the PowerPoint up there right, but it's Ephesians chapter 5. There's a couple of texts just to look at, so you can turn there. I'll just have us turn, please. Ephesians chapter 5. It's good to see it for yourself in the Bible. I like the screen. I do like it because you can kind of get those texts up there, and it makes so you can take out your app, plug in the number, and go, or you can turn your pages. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 24 says, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. But I don't want you to jump to the wives section. Wives, it's not Mother's Day message yet. All right, so not yet. And he says, as the church submits to Christ, and we can just blow right by that. But here's what he just does. He says, look, this is how the church lives. And you say, oh, that's great. Well, it's the church. No, that's you and me if we're believers. This is what the church does. Why? Because it's the nature of salvation. What does the church do? That lives in submission to its head. Jesus is the head. We live in submission to him. That's how the church lives. And if you don't live in submission to him, then you're not part of the church. So this is what the church does. And then in light of that, he says, wives, you live in submission to your husband. Now, I'd just say men, on the Father's Day side of that equation, just remember, the more you're like Christ, the whole lot easier it is for your wife to submit to you. Okay? Now, ladies, just remember, it's not a performance-based issue. It is demand to you to live in submission to him, just as it's a demand to him to love you sacrificially, not rooted in performance, all right? Because if God just loved us conditioned on performance, you and I wouldn't be loved. Okay? So we live in this submission, and it's seen again, you don't have to turn there, but Titus gives that instruction to ladies to be submissive to their own husbands. We find in Titus 2 that the bondservants would be submissive to their masters in everything, and so that slave was being submission to the master, and we take that and make that application into our cultural context, that as an employee, we are to be in submission to our employer. And we live that reality out because rebellion died the day of salvation and relationships have been changed by the gospel. It's part of living out the gospel in the context of life that it reflects and how we treat people and how we respond to the authorities that God puts over us. And so he talks about wives in submission to husbands and slaves in submission to masters. Even comes into the body of Christ and says live in submission one to another. Respect one another, live in submission to one another. He moves on into the church in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, you might want to turn there. 1 Corinthians 16. First Corinthians 16, beginning in verse 15, as he's closing out this letter of 1 Corinthians. And he writes, now I urge you, brothers, you know the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. And so this household, this Stephanas is now a servant of the saints. He's leadership in the church, pastoral. Be subject to such as these and every fellow worker and laborer. Be subject to spiritual leaders in the church. And if that wasn't clear enough, Hebrews 13 says, obey your leaders, submit to them. For they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy, not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. So in our text this morning, we find that God is calling his children to live in submission to governing authorities. And that submission is found, that demand is found in all kinds of relationships to God-ordained authorities. And he's going to root the reality of this in this fact that God is the only true authority. God's the only true authority. He owns it all. He created it all. He owns it all. You were made by God and for God. You can live in rebellion. You live in rebellion against God one day, you are going to meet God as your judge and destroyer. Because all rebellion will ultimately be destroyed. If you haven't figured out, want to talk about end story reality of the Bible, the end story of reality is all rebellion will be destroyed forever. Because God will reign over all of his creation and will dwell with his people, saved by grace forever. And they will never, ever rebel again. And then we will have fullness of joy. Isn't that an amazing thing? Because we all think, just think back when you're you think back child, teenager. Yeah, I can think back as a teenager. When mom and dad put certain restrictions on you, you thought, man, it would be so much fun when I didn't have those restrictions in my life. When I can just do what I want to do. And we tend to think always restrictions bad. I just need to be free to do what I want to do. You see where that's got us as a culture. And the reality is that's so antithetical to truth. The day I will have fullness of joy is in the day when I will never again do my own pleasure. I will do only what pleases God. You know, that really is the aim of faith. True faith aims at pleasing God in everything it does. So we come to the first point. Love submits to authority because love trusts God to accomplish his purpose. We're simply talking about the nature of true faith. True faith loves. True faith trusts. So true faith trusts God. And if we trust God, then we can live in submission to the authorities that God has created. So 1-4, he says, let every person be subject to governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. For those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is a servant of God. He is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out the wrath of God on the wrongdoer. And so the Greek text literally begins where our translation says, let every person. It literally begins with all souls, all lives, all people, without exception, are called on to live in this kind of submission. Why? Because you were made by God and for God. You were made by God. So all governing authorities are from God. And so you fundamentally have been called to live in submission to God, and then God has placed authorities, and all other authorities are delegated authority. Whatever authority you exercise in this world, whether it's as a husband leading a household, or as a worker, an employer leading an employment force, or in a church leading, whatever that aspect of leadership that God has ordained, it's always delegated authority. We don't have any authority of our own. It has been an entrusted authority to be carried out for God's purposes and for the good of God's people in his creation. That's why they exist. And that is their task. That is their God-given task. And all people, without exception, are called to live that way because it is a reflection of living in submission to God. And the command, as I mentioned earlier, pushes at the nature of worship, but also the nature of true conversion. You know, when God in his grace saved us, he saved us from our rebellion. I mean, before salvation, we had rebellious hearts. We simply wanted to do what we wanted to do. We wanted what we want when we wanted it. We tend to be that way a little bit anyway. You know, that's why we like fast food. Go to window A, order it, have it your way, get it at window B, and out the door we go. We want it our way, and we want it fast. We want it now. And that just appeals to the nature of our depravity and our sin nature and the desire to have it our way and really live in that self-absorption. But God changes all of that. Conversion changes everything. And when God brings spiritual life, he grants the gifts of faith and repentance. And by these gifts by their very nature bring about a submissive change of heart. We have a dead, cold heart, a rock heart that has to be ripped out and a heart of flesh put in. And that heart of flesh is no longer rebellious by nature, because it's a God-given, transformed nature that now lives out the reality of the gospel. Folks, we are talking about gospel reality. Knowing Christ equals a transformed heart that now lives in joyful submission. He roots this in two different issues. In two different ways he supports it. The first one is simply that God ordained the authorities these authority structures to serve him. Why should we live in submission to God-ordained authorities? Because God ordained them. They're from him. And because he has put them into our lives, we are then to live this way. So there's no authority except from God. God has instituted it. And so government, we've all had this, well, maybe all of you haven't had this happen. I had 4 children, right? At different times in life, you pick one of these children and you tell them to go deliver a message to the rest. Go tell them to do this. Dad said. Anybody done that? It's delegated authority at that moment, right? So you pick children A. Matt, go tell all the rest of your siblings they need to come in from what you're doing, get cleaned up, get to the dinner table in 5 minutes. Let's go. Please go do that. And they go, all right. They bark out the commands, and then behind it is, Dad said. And Dad said to give me your allowance for the next month. Okay, at that moment, they just crossed the line, right? Because they no longer were speaking what really Dad said. They no longer were taking the authority delegated them for the good of the one who delegated it. They now took that position of authority and began to use it for their own end, at which point they lost all authority. Okay? And so God has given authority to government, right? Absolutely. Am I to live in submission to that? Absolutely. But does government take the authority God's given it and twist it to their own benefit? Well, sure. And at times do they ask us to do things that we cannot do? Absolutely. Submission is not equal to obedience. You notice when I went through all the texts that said submission, because some of you were probably thinking, well, children live in submission to parents, right? But the text says children obey and honor your parents, right? It doesn't give you that option. It just comes at it and says submit. Obey. Flat out, obey. Now, again, the limitation on obedience is going to be no one can be commanded to sin against God. No one has that authority. No one has ultimate authority, okay? But that submission at the point of which you would cast off an authority structure over you is at a point in time when they have taken their God-given right to reign for good of God's people and they've turned it into a self-absorbed system of oppressiveness that is demanding people to follow in disobedience to God. No government has a right to ask. So why does the Chinese meet in house churches? Because the government does not have a right to tell them not to assemble. Government can go in and arrest them for assembling. Yep, they can. But the government does not have a right to tell them not to assemble. And so they continue to assemble as believers. And you know what? It may cost them imprisonment, even life. The book of Revelation deals with this. The day is coming when God's going to take his church off the earth and Antichrist is going to establish a throne of power. And he's going to have such power, he's going to demand people come and worship him. And if you don't worship him, it will be the cost of death. The mark of the beast is genuine. You will have to be in submission to his authority, or no buying, trading, selling. Life will be absolutely miserable for those who cast off the authority of the Antichrist. But you read through the book of Revelation, and there are people being saved throughout that period of time, and God calls on them not to receive the mark of the beast and to live in rebellion to that government authority, because that government authority is calling for worship of him, not worship of the true God. And even at the cost of their life, they cast off that authority. So governing authorities don't have absolute authority. It's very clear. The call to live in submission. But the interesting part is Paul is dealing with a Roman oppressive system, and while I just brought out the exceptions to the rule, and we can all get there and say, there's exceptions, we don't live, they don't have absolute authority, and that's all true. We can run there awful fast because Paul doesn't run there in that text. And we can want to cast off our own lack of submission to the authorities over our life really quickly without wrestling with the punch of the passage and without wrestling with what Paul is actually saying, which your rebellion to authority may reveal rebellion against God. So don't be quick to go there. Don't be quick, because authorities are ordained by God and by God for the good. And don't be quick to live in rebellion against them, right? That's what he is driving at. And in fact, he sounds forth a warning that just ought to startle us. Those who resist authorities, if you go back to Romans 13, or if you're in Romans 13, in verse 2, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Folks, that ought to be frightening to us. Why? Because what judgments he's talking about, he's not talking about the judgment of the authority. He's saying if you live in ongoing rebellion against the authorities God has ordained, you're ultimately in rebellion against God, and he will be your judge. He's saying your faith that you profess and your worship you suggest are fraudulent if your life is characterized by rebellion to authority. And those whose lives are so characterized will face the very wrath of God, not the welcoming presence of God. The second reason he gives is that God's purpose for delegated authority is to be ministers for good. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad, and you should have no fear and do what is right, and you will receive approval. Now, that's the way it's supposed to work. I mean, the government is supposed to honor what's right and supposed to punish what's evil, and it's not based on political correctness. You know, the government doesn't have a right to decide right and wrong based on what's politically expedient, does it? Does it? I'm asking. Does our government have a right to decide certain things are now moral that for all time we obviously know the Bible says it's immoral. But, you know, it hasn't been, I mean, even if you can't really dismiss the Bible authorities on everything, right? So, I mean, our government is declaring things today to be moral or acceptable that God stands absolutely opposed to, right? Okay, it's happening all the time. But God has said, here's what government's supposed to do. But also press that down in every authority relationship. So, Dad, when you have authority in your home, and you don't have a right to set your rules for your own benefit. You don't. It's not about you. It's about the good of God's people. It's about your family loving and serving Christ. You don't have a right to set rules for your own benefit. Employers, you know what? You don't have a right to set rules for your own benefit. You're supposed to set rules are for the good of your employees to help them know and love Christ. Every authority structure that exists is to exist for this reason. God created them. And you know what? They're all going to be held accountable to God. Remember, Jesus is going to destroy all authorities that are in rebellion against God. Every authority structure that's been established for this purpose. This is what it exists for. This is what it's been tasked to do. In fact, one of the things I would say to you, this is a tremendous instruction for Christian voting. You don't vote expedient. You vote for people who actually have a conviction about what's right and wrong. Or elsewise you sin against God. You and I have been called on to promote this kind of thing in government and to submit to government authorities and to praise them that do what's right and hold up what's right. We're to do that in every aspect of that submissive relationship to authority. We are to hold up, commend those who are promoting what is good and not those that are promoting what is evil. And God says, remember, they're my servant. They're ultimately an avenger that carries out wrath on the wrongdoer. I read a rather appalling illustration of how far our society has fallen. And I read it, and I stood in disbelief. And then I said, no, I'm not in that much disbelief anymore. And then I just wept. I said, Lord, how do we get here as a society? You know, we are now shipping remains of aborted babies to a power plant in Oregon and burning them for fuel. You say, well, I'm not doing it. You're part of the United States of America, a citizen of this country who now has declared that it is ethical and moral to slaughter babies by the millions and send their carcass to a power plant and burn them for fuel. That's where we are as a nation. And I just ask myself, and I ask you this question. Where's our desperation for revival? Where's our heart-wrenching cry for God to change lives? Where's our passion to take the gospel into this dark world and see people rescued? Are we that consumed with ourselves that we don't care? When government oversteps its moral and ethical boundaries, like legalizing homosexual marriage, declaring it's okay to smoke pot, offering or demanding that your children take sex education in school, which demands everything or teaches everything except abstinence until marriage, then we don't submit. We say no. Love submits to authority. Second point you see there in verses 5 and 6. Love submits to authority because love overcomes evil with good. Just tying back to the prior text, ends that way in Romans 12. In verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So he says, therefore one must be in subjection, and you just can't miss the punch. Therefore you must. This is demanded, absolutely demanded, not only to avoid God's wrath, and he's tying now back to the fact that the authority is an avenger of God's wrath on those who do evil. So he's moved out of eternal judgment now, and he's talking about you don't just need to obey your government because you're afraid of what they're going to do to you. Because if that's the only reason why you obey, then you're going to obey things you shouldn't obey, right? If your obedience to a governing authority is just rooted in fear, you're going to do what they say because you're afraid of what they're going to do to you, then you're going to do things in, quote, obedience to that authority that you shouldn't do. Because they don't have a right to tell you to sin, ever, right? So he said you should be afraid of doing evil, of violating the good laws of your government, even if you don't agree with them. But if they haven't asked you to sin, you know what? It doesn't matter if I agree with it or not, does it? They're not asking me to sin. It doesn't matter if you like the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit or the 15 in the school zone, or it doesn't matter if you like the fact that or don't like the fact that, when you go to pull a tree out of your yard, now you got to go get a permit, or you got to do this. It doesn't matter if you like those rules or not. If they're not asking me to sin, then I need to follow the rules of law, right? Okay, so, and I should do it out of fear and respect. They respect their right to rule, fear their power to punish, and it's okay to live there, but it's not an absolute. Because if that was absolute, then you would just obey whatever they said because you're afraid of what they're going to do. The pastors in China have been locked up. Those men have been in jail before. They're in jail again. They have called not to live in fear what the government's going to do to them. They're going to get out of jail. You know what they're going to do? They're going to continue preaching the gospel. And that means they may end up in jail again. It may mean that they could lose their lives, their families, their incomes, their livelihood, their home. All of that's on the line. What are you going to do? You going to obey your government when it tells you to sin against God? No. And if you do, then you violate and really deny your faith. So he shifts then, he says it's not, fear of the authority is not enough. It's okay. You should not want to incur wrath for doing what's wrong, but you should do it more so for the sake of conscience. That God has given you a moral conscience, a part of being created in the image of God, and your moral conscience constantly is passing judgment on what's right and what's wrong. In fact, you could read the rest to keep going in Romans. We'll get there, 14, 15. He deals with weaker and stronger brethren in connection to revelation. Oftentimes today, common in American Christianity is the strong guy is the guy who can live as close to the world, as close to sin. And he's strong in the faith because he can do all this with liberty of conscience. And the weak guy doesn't have liberty. No. The strong and weak argument is rooted in what you know about the Word of God. The strong brother knows what God has actually said is right and wrong and lives by the word. The weak brother has concluded certain things may be wrong because he came out of a pagan world and he doesn't want to be associated with that pagan world. And as far as he's concerned, that still is. An illustration in the Bible of that is in their day, they had pagan temples. And at those pagan temples, they would do sacrifices of animals. Kind of like trying to mirror a little bit of what was happening in the real worship of God. So they would do a sacrifice of an animal. They would eat a meal. And they would do a lot of animals, and they'd eat meals, and some of that stuff would be left over, right? So what would they do with it? Well, they weren't going to waste it. They didn't have freezers. They took it to the marketplace, and they sold it. And so you would go to the marketplace to buy meat. The reality is some of that meat was offered the night before at a pagan worship. And the believers were in debate on whether or not they could eat that, right? And those that had been saved out of paganism, think about it. You used to go to the temple, participate in it, eat that animal sacrifice. You get saved. You turn away from that paganism. You come into the church, and you're alongside with another brother, and they're going down the marketplace, and they reach in to buy a piece of meat, and that guy's going, wait a minute. That was offered an idol last night. You ever been to that temple? You seen what's happened there? You can't eat that. And Paul weighs into this reality and says, look, the Bible says meat is meat, idols are nothing. So you can go to the markets, you can eat it if your conscience is clear about it, but you can't do this. If I'm there and my brother's beside me and he's saying, don't eat that, that was offered to an idol, at that point in time he says, don't do it. Because I would be sinning against God by sinning against my brother. Yeah, but he's wrong. It doesn't matter. You don't violate or force somebody else to violate their conscience. Now, you and my conscience need to be informed by the Word of God. My conscience constantly needs to be updated, and here's the reality. Our conscience gets so much of our right and wrong judgment based on the culture around us rather than the Word. That's why if you're not a student of the Word, washing constantly your mind by the Word, you're gonna prove things that you should not. In fact, you can just read those passages. Blessed is he who is not condemned by what he approves, because God is the ultimate authority, not you, not me, not my conscience. But what God says to me is don't violate your conscience. Remember, I gave you that conscience. And I've transformed your nature by grace, and you now have a heart that is by nature wants to live in submission. And here's one of those things. Every time you begin to well up in rebellion, you ought to go, whoa, don't go there. It ought to tinge your conscience. And if it doesn't, your conscience is not properly functioning. If you can be glad to live in rebellion against authority, there's a problem. Your conscience is out of whack. The desire, I mentioned this earlier, but the ultimate desire, true desire that comes from faith, is to please God in all we do. In verse 6, Paul points to an example of submission that the Romans understood. You pay taxes. He didn't just say you should, he said you do. You understand their power of taxation. Anybody here? We just finished tax time, right? Gabby was all excited. Tax day finished. She's an accountant. She loved it because, she has to do all this stuff, prepping taxes. Gabby, what happens to people who don't pay their taxes? Okay, the IRS is a governing authority that's there for our good. Ow, that hurts. I mean, that hurts to say that one. Anybody been audited? I have. They're so nice and kind. Do they have the right? Absolutely. Do I like it? No. Not really. Do I think that there's taxation that's beyond what we ought to be as a country? Uh-huh. What's my responsibility? To vote for somebody who might do something about it. But other than that, I need to live in submission to it until they tell me I can't give to God. I don't like it. But they have authority, and I'm to respect it. And so I pay taxes. There are groups run around, and I've met one of them. A guy came to our church one time. He was part of I forgot what they call themselves. They were up in Michigan. They're they have their own little militia. I forgot what they call themselves, but then they were just dead set. Basically like most of Pauline epistles, they just denied. They called themselves believers, followers of Christ, but they denied all the Pauline epistles, and they would not pay taxes. They wouldn't take any government. They made no government documentation. They're going to take a driver's license, social security cards, and all of this stuff. And they lived in rebellion against authority. And the reason why I end up with this guy here is his wife finally had the courage to walk away because, see, they live in rebellion against authority, but then they demand absolute submission to theirs. And he was brutalizing his family, his wife, and his children. And she escaped. And then this guy, he actually came to our church, and I had long conversations with him, and I finally, I had to tell him, I said, sir, I'm just going to tell you as straightly as I can. You don't have the first clue what the gospel really says. His life was in complete rebellion against authority. and what he was demanding of his wife and family was elevating him to a position of God. He wasn't governing for their good. Paul gives this example, and he points to an area in which sometimes we struggle to submit joyfully and willingly. And then he comes to verse 7 and he says, pay to all what is owed. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So love submits because love thinks more of others than it does of itself. He uses the imagery of debt. Pay what's owed. Pay what is owed to God-ordained authorities, governing or otherwise. Live in submission to their rule over you. So even when they're intrusive and you live that way in submission for God, by God's grace and for God's glory. And he puts these 4 obligations, and the first 2 does with their right to exact money. They have the power to tax directly and indirectly. Indirectly would be like when we got hit last month with a surface water assessment coming from the tax office to the church, but they called it new packaging. It's not a tax, it's an assessment. Now, it's just a fancy way to retitle and skip the fact and get around the fact that we are a tax-exempt entity by our government law, and we have that privilege, but they come around the corner. But you know what? They found a way to do it. They have a right to tax. You know what we had to do? We had to pay it. Did we want to send $1,200 or $1,300 to Pinellas County for the surface water assessment when they still don't fix our surface water issues? No, not at all. But did we have to do it? Yes, we did. Because they have the right to exact it. And the second has to do then with the positions of authority and what is owed to positions of authority. Respect and honor is to be given to those in positions of authority without them having to earn it. That's hard. We're all wired to think people need to earn our respect. It's not true. It's owed. It is to be given. It's the way we're to live. We're to live in respect and honor to the authorities God's placed in our life. Because it's a sign of living in respect and honor to the God who you don't see. And he doesn't have to earn your favor. Okay? And aren't you glad that you didn't have to earn his? I mean, we could take the poll today, and I would assure you it would be a 100% poll. What poll is that? No percent. Who gets 100%? Okay, here's my poll. Don't raise your hand. How many of you sinned this week? And the one who didn't raise his hand that you sinned, then we need a counseling. Okay, come see me afterwards because we need to explore that one. Because either I need to know your secret or you've deceived yourself. Okay, the reality is you struggle with sin. So what does that mean? Your sin deserves what? Death. Immediate judgment by God, destruction forever. There's not one of us this week who has not sinned. And God does not cast me away because of my sin. Why? Because my acceptance to God was never earned. It was given. It's the beauty of salvation, folks. You're here without Christ. Can I just appeal to you that salvation is such a beautiful gift? Because you don't deserve anything but God's judgment and his wrath. And there's nothing you can do to change that. And I know that's not good news. But the beautiful gift of the gospel is the God of heaven loves sinners like you and I. And Jesus Christ went to a cross of Calvary to pay your debt. He rose in victory. He accomplished righteousness. And he invites you to come. He invites you to turn from sin, repent of your sin in that self-life, and put your trust in him. And he will receive you and give you life forever that you never had to earn. And there'll never be a day when he will cast you away because you disappointed him. There will be never a day when he will say, enough with you. You've sinned against me this many times. I'm done with you. That will never happen. Jesus Christ loves you with everlasting love. The gospel is an amazing gift that sets us free from our rebellion and then enables us to love and respect authority like that. Do they deserve it? No, they don't deserve it. Not at all. Why do you give it? Because of what I've been given. Because of what I've been given. I then live this way because it's living the gospel in a dark world. It's what makes us light. It's what gives credibility to your witness. Without a heart of submission to the authorities that God has ordained in your life, you lack credible testimony of faith. That's what Paul is saying to the church in Rome. So where does that strike for you? A heart of submission? A heart of rebellion? Let's pray.